An effects loop is something that is built into an amplifier or sometimes a pedal that changes the way you can use your effects. That may not sound like much, but in this video, I'm going to go over the basics and then show you some powerful, possibly unexpected ways you can use one. If you have pedals, you've probably noticed that your sound can change a lot depending on what order you put your effects in. But there's one effect that can never be moved, which is the effect of your amp. Whatever breakup you're getting from your amp, as well as the larger sonic identity you get from your amp, that always is last by default. But what if there was some way to put pedals after that? Well, that's why effects loops were invented. The idea with an effects loop is that it's an insertion point in your amp that lets you run more effects after your amp has already had its way with your sound. So let's listen to some examples. This is what a flanger, the Boss HF2, sounds like going into my Marshall amp the normal way. And this is what it sounds like going in my Marshall amp's effects loop. Okay, what do we think? To me, in the effects loop, the effect sounded more total. Not necessarily better, just like more obvious. And that's normally how this goes. Whatever effects you put in an effects loop, that's going to be the final word on your sound. If you don't put anything in your amp's effects loop, then your amp is the final word on your sound. Okay, so now what should you do? Well, my honest advice is that you should take every pedal you have and put it in your amp's effects loop and see if you like it there better or not. And if you don't want to do that, and you just ask the internet for advice about what sort of effects typically go in effects loops, they're going to tell you normally reverbs and delays. And that's true. Reverbs and delays can sound good in an effects loop. But you should still experiment because there will always be exceptions. For instance, the Dick Dale sound is a spring reverb going into the front of a Marshall amp. If you put it in an effects loop, that's going to mess it up. And here's the proof. This is the sound of the Echo Fix spring reverb going in the front of my Marshall amp. Okay, but actually one piece of advice I have for something you should always do is put a clean boost in your amp's effects loop. A great candidate would be the 29 boost, but there are others. The TC Spark, even just an EQ that has a level boost. A clean boost in your amp's effects loop will make you louder no matter what. Sometimes boosts that go in the front of your amp the normal way will end up being more like an overdrive pedal. If your amp is breaking up at all, a clean boost can just kind of get converted into more distortion. But if you want a fail-safe nuclear option for getting louder at live gigs when it's time to take a solo, a clean boost in your effects loop will never go wrong. If your amp has an effects loop, you've probably noticed that its two jacks are labeled send and return. And the idea there is that your guitar goes into the amp's input, your amp does whatever it's going to do, but then your signal is sent back out of the amp into the input of whatever pedals you want to stick there. Then the output of the pedals comes to the return of the amp. So it returns to the amp before it gets amplified to its final volume and sent to the speakers. But if you want, you can also use an effects loop to like bypass the identity of your amp entirely and instead replace that with the sound of a pedal. Now, the distinction here is you're not coloring your amp with the sound of pedals. You're just like using pedals as a manual override on your amp completely. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, there's some pedals that come to life if you use them this way. For instance, the Boss Metal Zone. Believe it or not, the Boss Metal Zone becomes like a serious choice if you run it into an effects loop in this particular way I'm about to show you. Another strong choice is the Benson Preamp. This one can be a lifesaver if you like have to use an amp at a show that's like you have to use the backline gear, but you don't love that amp. If it has an effects loop, you can like bypass the identity of the amp and instead use the Benson Preamp. But you're not going to use the Benson Preamp in the effects loop in the normal way. Instead, what you're doing is you take the input of your guitar, send that to the input of this pedal, then send the output of the pedal to the return of your effects loop. So the input jack on your amp is empty and the send jack on your amp's effects loop is empty. Instead, everything is going straight to the return. Let's listen to what this sounds like. Here's me using an amp that is commonly found in like club backlines. Okay, now that's not terrible. That's usable in my opinion. But here's me running the Benson Preamp directly into the return of that amp's effects loop. I do prefer that. It sounds tighter and punchier to me. By the way, if you want to buy any of the gear in this video, I have affiliate links you can use that'll give me a small commission on anything you purchase. I'll put the affiliate links in the video description. Money. This whole time we've been talking about amplifiers, but sometimes pedals themselves will also have effects loops built into them. Now, what does that do? Well, that can do a few different things, but in my opinion, a good place to start is with delay pedals. Typically, if a delay pedal, like the Strymon Timeline, has an effects loop, what that means is you can run a secondary effect only in the loop of the delay, and then whatever repeats that the delay pedal issues, those repeats will have the effect in the loop. Okay, let's listen to an example. For this one, I'm using the Sending from Electronic Audio Experiments. This is also a delay pedal that has an effects loop in it. And in the effects loop, I put the Randy's Revenge, which is a ring modulator from Fairfield Circuitry. So what's happening here is I play guitar, my guitar is normal, it goes to the delay pedal repeats it, but then only those repeats have ring modulation on them. This is what that sounds like. Another pedal that has its own effects loop is the brand new Partner from Old Blood Noise Endeavors. Now this is a fuzz pedal, but what's happening here is that the effects loop it has, you can put another effect in there and then run that pedal and this pedal in parallel. Now what parallel means is like neither pedal is coming first. Your signal is split in two and then sent to the two different pedals and then combined together, but neither one is just being applied after the other one. They're like simultaneously doing their thing. There's a very specific thing you can do with this that I think is cool, which is normally, if I'm using fuzz, there's like two essential fuzz sounds, I think, in my opinion. One is like the ultra bassy, like Titanic thudding fuzz sound. This is the Partner doing that. other is like a ludicrous, trebly, like the sound of Velcro getting ripped apart sound. And my go-to for that is the ZVEX Fuzz Factory. This is the Fuzz Factory doing that. Now, you can never really get one fuzz pedal to make both of those sounds because the settings are completely different. But if you put the ZVEX Fuzz Factory in the effects loop of the partner and then set it to be parallel, you can get those two sounds at the same time. This is what that sounds like. It's pretty trashy. When it comes to pedals that have their own effects loops, in my opinion, there is a final boss. And the final boss is the hors d'oeuvre from Fairfield Circuitry. This pedal is only an effects loop. It doesn't do anything until you plug another pedal into it, but then what it lets you do is reroute your signal through that pedal that's plugged into this pedal over and over and over and over again. So you can get other pedals to feed back against themselves. There's some amazing discoveries to be made by putting different pedals into this one. My favorite thing is the Earthquaker Tentacle. That's just an analog octave effect. But if you put it in here and crank it up, it becomes very strange. It becomes this. You might be thinking that sounded too awful, but in my opinion, there are ways to use that. My favorite thing to do is take a sound like that and then use it to play some like real tragic chord progression, like something like Eric Carmen would do. Those kinds of chords, like the heartbroken chords of the 70s. To take an awful sound like that and then play something in that style, I think is cool. So what you're about to hear is a piece of a song on my next record. This is unfinished. This is a work in progress. But the guitar sound is me putting the tentacle through this and then trying to play some romantic bullshit.